Good evening, everybody, and welcome once again to History Author Talks. I'm glad to see you all once again, and I wanted to let everybody know that I have just come back from the leadership conference for the Sons of the American Revolution, and I am very excited with some of the new initiatives that we're launching there. I'm on the education committee and the schools outreach subcommittee. So I'm going to be spending my year putting together programs and letting all the teachers out there know about the Sons of the American Revolution youth programs and some of our other initiatives. We've got a podcast called Revolutionary Rarities, which you should Google. It's fun, fast history. And we also have a program called Speaking Out About History, which is going to also feature our guest tonight. So as we move into the program for this evening, I wanted to just make the comment that, military tactics and strategy are fascinating studies. And I've always been interested also in the social aspects of conflict. How does war affect the civilian population? Well, tonight we're going to do something a little different. In the past, we've focused primarily on one book. Tonight, as we welcome in the fall semester as a treat, we're going to talk about three books. Dr. Benjamin Carp graduated from Yale and then moved on to the University of Virginia for his master's and also his Ph.D. He is currently the professor and Daniel M. Lyons Chair of History at Brooklyn College, CUNY, and he has taught classes on fear and violence, the colonial period of the American history, 19th century American history, women in early America, and military history before 1900. His list of books and publications, conference presentations, seminars, and media appearances are about a mile long. You can find more about Ben Carp on his website, benjamincarp.com. So with that, I would like to now introduce you all to Dr. Benjamin Carp. There we go. Ben,
hi, everybody.
Welcome to History Author Talks.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting.
Well, Ben's books in order which they were published were first Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution, and then The Defiance of Patriots, the Boston Tea Party, and the Making of America, and then The Great New York Fire of 1776, the lost story of the American Revolution, which just recently came out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go a little out of order here. The first book was Rebels Rising, but I'm going to start with your second book. December 16th, 2023 will be the 250th anniversary of what has become known as the Boston Tea Party. 3 years and 9 months after the Boston Massacre and a year and 7 months after the Gaspee affair off of Newport, Rhode Island, your book, Defiance of Patriots, we learned how Bostonians dumped 46 tons of tea into Boston Harbor in an act that was really more an attack on a corporation. The problem was that the corporation in question was getting government bailout of sorts. That's what we're going to talk about. Explain the British East India Company, Ben, and its connections with the British government.
Sure. I mean, back during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, right? The English government at the time, the English crown, did not really have the funds or the will to set up an empire all its own. And so what it essentially said to venturers of various kinds, private enterprises, is, all right, if you want to go out and establish a beachhead for the crown, and you're willing to take on that risk, we will grant you a monopoly. Actually, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was kind of company, right? And the Virginia Company were kind of founded in that way. So that was really the birth of the American colonies. Now, over in South Asia, Indonesia, and China, what you had was the East India Company, which remains a company up until the 19th century. and it was given a monopoly on all British trade east of the Cape of Good Hope, and it becomes a kind of territorial power in some of its domains, in the same way that the Dutch East and West India companies had.
So let's take a step back with the Boston Tea Party here. Why tea? What was so special about tea, and what was the end game of this protest? What did the participants expect to gain from what they were about to do, what they did?
Sure, that's like 7 questions in a trench coat. I mean, tea was special because it was caffeinated, because it was thought to have all sorts of health benefits, because it was, there were so many ceremonies and rituals surrounding it. It's just an amazing beverage. At the time, only grown in China, right? Some people may be familiar with Darjeeling or Assam or Earl Grey varieties of tea that were grown in India. Those didn't come around until the British start having tea plantations in the 1800s. So it's really only coming, for the most part, coming from like 2 provinces in China, both black and green teas. And they tried to severely limit the tea that got out. Some of it for years had been going out in caravans to Central Asia, to Russia. But the Europeans in the West, in Western Europe, begin developing an appetite for it sometime, more or less in the 1600s. And it's become cheaper and cheaper and more widespread, so that by the 1700s, the English and the British in particular are just mad for tea. And so are their colonists in the Americas. I mean, there were all sorts of, again, rituals associated with it, women hosting around the tea table, people enjoying tea to keep themselves awake. Much more popular than at the time than coffee or chocolate were, although both of those were available as well. And it was really a signifier of belonging, of a little kind of taste of the elite that you could purchase on your own. Maybe if you were a kind of lower middle class person, you might not be able to afford, silk garments or really fancy ceramics or silver or things like that, but you could afford tea, and you could have that daily enjoyment of luxury. So tea was a very big deal. And the British knew that when in 1767 they passed the Townshend duties, right? We don't remember most of the other things that were taxed: paper, lead, glass, etc., because Parliament then ended up repealing those in response to American protests in 1770. But Parliament kept that tax on tea because it was the biggest revenue generator of all the enumerated commodities in the Revenue Act of 1767 that passed those Townshend duties. And so in 1773, that tax on tea was still in place. And so Eastern merchants in America had decided, oh, well, we all love tea, but we really need to boycott this English tea in protest of the tax. They still drank tea, but what they drank was tea that was smuggled from other European East India companies, the Dutch, the Danish, et cetera, the various Germans. So they're drinking smuggled tea. In New York and Philadelphia, if you look at customs records, they bring their legal tea imports down to absolutely zero. Boston actually was not as well behaved from a Sons of Liberty perspective. They did manage to import some legal English tea. And so when you get into 1773, you actually have Sons of Liberty in New York and Philadelphia being like, I don't know if we can trust these Bostonians to be at the forefront of this patriot movement. They, really seem like they kind of weren't holding up their end of these non-importation agreements. And so when Parliament passes the Tea Act, again, they keep this duty on American tea, but they think, oh, Americans are going to love this. The Tea Act is going to allow the East India Company to ship tea directly to the American colonies, which will make tea cheaper for American consumers, right? You cut out various middlemen. Now Americans will be able to drink tea even more cheaply. And the Tea Act was really not meant to be a measure having anything to do with the American colonies, really. It was really meant to just bail out, as you said before, the East India Company, right? They had a bunch of surplus tea in their warehouses. They needed to offload it. Let's come up with an easy way for them to dump this excess tea on the American colonial market. Well, the Americans see this and smell a rat, and they say, oh my God, this is a way to seduce us into paying a tax for which we haven't given consent. It also establishes the precedent of allowing a monopoly company to sell directly to us. So we really don't like that either, right? If we allow these precedents to stand, Parliament will try and tax us out of existence, and they will try and crowd all of our own merchants out of the market through monopolies of various kinds. There was also an issue in that the money generated from the tax on tea paid the salaries of various Massachusetts officials. In Massachusetts, they really would have preferred that the assembly pay those salaries so that there would be a little bit more accountability to the popular branch of government. So there's all these problems with tea. And the Bostonians are facing peer pressure from New York and Philadelphia. So when the tea arrives in November, there's basically a 20-day window that the tea is either going to get the tea basically has to get landed. You can't just hang out in the harbor with dutiable goods on board like indefinitely. The tea was going to have to get landed. Well, the Bostonians don't want to land the tea because then it'll be sold, and somebody will end up having to pay the tax. And Massachusetts officials won't let the tea ships just turn around and bring the tea back to London, because that was illegal, and it would have required Governor Hutchinson to kind of look the other way in a way that he wasn't willing to do. So the Bostonians are like, all right, we can't land it and we can't send it back. We really only got one choice here. And so they dump these 46 tons of tea into the harbor. That's about as quick a summary as I can do.
Well, no, that was fantastic. You did a great job there. I tell you, that is terrific. So to sum it up, though, the British thought that they were doing the colonists a favor by diminishing the tax. And
I mean, the tax was not diminished, right? Like they knew that the Americans didn't like the tax, but they're like, well, maybe we'll get them to swallow it by making the underlying commodity cost less. You see what I mean? Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So the Tea Party was economically driven, and that's what we've established here. And we know many of the names of the leading dissident Sons of Liberty: Sam Adams, Joseph Warren, John Hancock, Otis, and others. What was the social stratification of those who organized the Tea Party versus those who participated?
Well, this is like such a fascinating question. That's like my favorite question about the Boston Tea Party, because one of the things that I really like about the Boston Tea Party is that it gives us an opportunity not just to talk about Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, Thomas Young, William Molyneux, John Hancock, right? These leading figures, but to talk about these ordinary like boat builders and coopers and apprentices who actually did the work of throwing the tea into the harbor. Normally, we don't know who's participating in various street actions and protests, the kinds of things that we know eventually led to American liberty. But in the case of the Boston Tea Party, we do have a list of names, sketchy though it might be, that gives us kind of an indicator of the types of people who had dumped the tea into the harbor. So I love that. And the interesting thing that I say in the book, as far as who planned the Tea Party or who motivated the Tea Party, is that we actually have evidence of two different things. On the one hand, we have evidence of, sure, the elites kind of saying to ordinary Bostonians, like, we know what we're doing as far as protesting the acts of Parliament. We want you to be here on this night. Get ready to dump the tea. We're going to use you for your strong backs. And there you go. And one thing that I noticed in looking at the Caleb Davis papers at Massachusetts Historical Society, he was a prominent merchant and a patriot, is that a lot of the people who participated in the Boston Tea Party had worked for him at some point, right? So it's like, so we could say, oh, this is an employer kind of telling his trusted guys what to do, right? And we know that colonial society was often quite deferential. People, didn't bow to their betters in the streets, but like in the South, that might not be unheard of, right? There was a lot of kind of, oh, you're wealthy. Okay, I'm going to elect you to office. I'm going to do what you say. You're going to be my creditor. You're going to, I'm going to show you respect in the street. Colonial society was a little bit more hierarchical that way. Even New England, which tended to be a bit more egalitarian in nature, there was still a lot of deference to the upper crust. But then there's also evidence of, there was I can't remember who it was, but there was an ordinary Tea Party member who said, I remember gathering with a bunch of other artisans like me, craftsmen, guys who worked with their hands. And we called upon one of these wealthy Bostonians to kind of say, hey, we know that there's going to have to be some action about the tea. What should we do? Do you want to give us orders? And this wealthy merchant declined to give them orders. He only said, if you go, you will find friends. So there's some evidence that, that the craftsmen, that the working people of Boston were taking initiative on their own to plan this action out, to coordinate who was going to be doing what, who's going to be able to unload 3 ships carrying tea really quickly, guys who know their way around a ship, right? That's not going to be a wealthy merchant. That's going to be dockhands and shipbuilders, exactly the kind of people that we see in the social profile of the participants in the Boston Tea Party.
Where did you dig up all those names? I mean, I'm sure you spent time in the Massachusetts Historical Society.
Yeah, well, the New England Historic and Genealogical Society, everywhere that I could go. I mean, digitization really helped here because there was a lot of random stuff that popped up in old books, 18th century newspapers that also gave me clues. The work that genealogists have done, enabled me to figure out who was related to who by marriage. So I used bits from all over. I was teaching at Tufts University at the time, and I taught a class on Massachusetts in the American Revolution, and I actually took 16 or so people who I thought not too prominent, not too obscure. And I said, all right, go and find out as much as you can about these guys. And they did, some of them did great work. Like throughout history, there have been two guys with the same name. And a lot of historians thought it was one guy, but it's actually the other guy. Like the undergraduates too did a lot of really creative work in puzzling out some of these guys' identities. And I think that was really fun for them. This was years ago.
So in doing your research, I mean, what was your sense? I mean, these men were the colonial white working class. Were they all protesting, or was the Tea Party a good example of mob rage militaire? I mean,
I mean, I don't think so. It's too, there's too much forethought for it. There were spontaneous acts of rioting of crowd action that came from immediate reaction anger, right? When Ebenezer Richardson shoots Christopher Sider in the streets, right, there's an immediate angry reaction by the crowd that was already surrounding Richardson's house. So you could get a crowd to be enraged, but that's not what the Boston Tea Party is. The Boston Tea Party is definitely planned in advance. Some people may have joined spontaneously, but again, this is a pretty small town, right? 16,000 people, right? There are colleges with larger populations than that. 16,000 people, only fewer than a quarter of whom would have been adult men, right? So you're talking about a really close-knit waterfront community where they all kind of knew each other and they knew who to trust. And so, you said before, oh, it's all economically motivated. Well, that's true, but there are political principles at stake that I think these ordinary Bostonians understood. And they understood it in part because guys like Samuel Adams were very effective communicators. As a legislative leader, as the head of the Boston Committee of Correspondence, as somebody who knew how to connect with people from all walks of life, right? Like the elite has to work to persuade the working class that like they need to be politically aggrieved. But the working class kind of comes to that conclusion and winds up agreeing with the fancier merchants and politicians about that.
So let's talk about the secrecy aspect about it all. Why
Yeah.
Mohawks? What was the relationship New Englanders had with their Indians, and why Mohawks?
Yeah, it's so complicated. I have to spend an entire chapter figuring this out. But it's a great segue from what we were talking about before, right? Like these guys swear each other to secrecy, and none of them really come forward for another 50 years, just about, right? So they never tell. But I think everyone knew who they were, right? Even in the dark, and when a person has their face covered, how your cousin walks or how your neighbor carries himself. All these guys, I think, were identifiable. What the disguises are meant to be were symbolic disguises, right? Because we are disguised, you are not supposed to know who we are. Therefore, don't talk about who we are. That's really what the disguises are. Now, given that they could be disguising themselves as anything, why Mohawks? Why Native Americans? I mean, there had been some precedent for dressing up as women or Catholic priests or non-white people or scapegoating non-white people in previous crowd actions. So that part of it might not be so surprising. But I also think there was an obsession with Native American identity among a lot of white colonists. And Phil Deloria, the son of the famous Native activist Vine Deloria, he's now at Harvard. He wrote a great book before mine called Playing Indian, about the history of whites adopting Indian identities. And he uses the Boston Tea Party as his first example. And he says, the Boston Tea Partiers dressing up as Indians allows them to have what they think is the best of both worlds. They are as fierce and independent and brave as the natives, but they are not actually natives. Everybody remembers that they are white guys underneath. And so they still get to have the kind of what they think are the trappings of European civilization, right? And so that is what makes them uniquely American. They're not native, but they're also no longer European or British. They have remade themselves as something else, and that is what the Indian disguises, I think, are meant to represent. I mean, there's a whole bunch more I could say about it, but those are some of the.
And you mentioned that we really didn't know who any of these guys were until about 50 years later. Explain that. I mean, why they, if you're victorious in battle, you you get medals and you march and pats on the back from all your fellow soldiers. Why did these guys basically go into hiding and say, no, it wasn't me?
I mean, who know, like, I don't know that they were fully in hiding. I think probably their families and neighbors knew what they had done, but they didn't see any reason to brag about it. I mean, it probably has something to do with other kinds of codes of secrecy among fraternal organizations as they existed in the 18th century. But the other thing is, yeah, even though they eventually get their independence from the crown, first of all, that wasn't certain until 1783, 10 years later. And the other thing is, there was still maybe a risk of civil liability, right? That the East India Company, which still exists as an entity, could have sued these guys for damages. I mean, the stuff cost, 90,000 British pounds sterling. Like, a ton of tea was the same value as Paul Revere's house in the North End. So multiply the value of Paul Revere's house in the North End by 46 in order to get a sense of what the value of what was destroyed were, right? Like, this hurt the East India Company.
This was huge.
And the East India Company might have wanted to ask these guys as individuals for their money back, right? Instead, Parliament passes the Boston Port Act and says the entire town of Boston is going to have to repay the East India Company. But the town of Boston was like, "What? We didn't take any official acts leading to the destruction of the tea. Maybe we convened as the body of the people, but even then, it was a bunch of Mohawks who suddenly came in the room and started destroying the tea. They weren't even part of the body of the people. They were strangers, right? That's the other thing that the disguises were supposed to represent, is this is someone else doing this, and please don't hold the whole town of Boston liable. Instead, that's what Parliament does. And of course, a lot of people say, oh, it's the Boston Tea Party that galvanized the Americans to revolt against the British. No, it was the Parliament's reaction to the Boston Tea Party, right? The coercive acts that really gets the American colonists worried. Like, oh, maybe we didn't like what the Bostonians had done. Maybe we thought that was going a little bit too far. But Parliament trying to punish Boston in this way, trying to punish Massachusetts in this way, that's really ugly. That's really unconstitutional. That's when they begin convening as the First Continental Congress and begin importing gunpowder and training the militia and doing all the things that will eventually lead to the battles of Lexington and Concord.
So we have a question from our SAR Chaplain General, Dwight Elam. The Masons have any play in here? The Masons have a hand in this?
Some Masons did. There were members of the Freemasons, like Paul Revere, who participated in the act. In Paul Revere's Ride, David Hackett Fisher makes this point, which is that Boston's voluntary organizations, the North End Caucus, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, and the Sons of Liberty, that there were a series of like kind of overlapping organizations, a kind of loose network of mostly middle class guys who liked to hang out in taverns, right? And it's the subject of my first book, but who met, who dealt with matters of one kind or another, et cetera, et cetera. I think that when planning who was going to participate in the Boston Tea Party, they had the choice of drawing from any number of those organizations, and the Freemasons were certainly one. So I believe at the back of the book, where I have this appendix of the ostensible participants in the Boston Tea Party, I mention, I do, under political activities, I mark who among these 100 or so guys were Masons. So to page 235, you can look it up. There are at least half a dozen, probably maybe as many as a dozen.
So we've looked in the history books, we look at April 19th, 1775 as the beginning of the American Revolution, and we would be wrong. That was the date of the beginning of the military action. Reading Defiance of Patriots, you will learn why December 16th, 1773, 250 years ago this year, was really a beginning moment of the American Revolution, the American War for Independence, not by muskets, but by tea. The British reaction, as Ben said, is really what happens next. And Ben outlines this in the book and why we went to war with Mother Country. So not to give away too much, but I would also say to all of you who are listening to the program, if for no other reason, anyone interested in American history or why we ended up fighting the American Civil War 110 years after the Revolution needs to read chapter 10 of the Defiance of Patriots. I love this book. I recommend it to absolutely everybody. I think it is, especially now, since we are looking at December 2023 as the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. It's an ideal time and an ideal gift that you can give to yourself and anybody that you know. So go out and get a copy of the Defiance of Patriots. And now we're going to, as promised, we're going to move on to book 2, which was really book 1, as I said at the beginning, and Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution. It's a study of human geography, and Ben, you present the British American cities as a cauldron of political stew that boiled over into insurrection. Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. What were the demographics of these American ports, and what was the recipe for the turmoil that started the revolution? And how are they the same, and how are they the different? I know that, again, that's a million questions, but
Yeah.
I'd like to hear, but give us a tour of their colonial cities here.
Yeah, the demographics of these cities is that none of them are particularly large. Even Philadelphia, which was the largest, probably only had about 40,000 people on the eve of the revolution. New York, 25,000. Boston, as I said, 16. Charleston, maybe 12, I think, and Newport, only about 9,000 or so. So really not very large, but and only about 5% of colonial Americans probably lived in communities of like 2,500 people or more. So most of
and in comparison, what is London?
Oh, I don't remember what the population of London was at the time, but London is certainly way bigger. Mexico City is way bigger at the time. Edo or what's now Tokyo in Japan. There were lots of large metropolises in the world, but colonial America didn't have any yet.
Yep.
This is before New York City really hits its prime as far as growth. So small and close knit, but disproportionately important, right? Because this is where the printing offices are. This is where the seat of government is. This is where the major merchants are, and all the kind of attendant urban things that you need in order to muster capital. This is where the insurers are. All this other stuff. This is where a lot of the shipbuilding takes place, manufacturing, right? Cities are complex. Cities are dynamic, and they are very interesting places to do politics and then disseminate those political ideas out into the countryside. So the way this was based on my dissertation, and the way that I made my own dissertation manageable so that I could finish and get my degree were to kind of pick a different kind of place where politics was going on in each of these cities. So I did the Boston waterfront community, which eventually inspired the Tea Party book, obviously. I did taverns in New York City. I did houses of worship in Newport. Newport, a really interesting place to study urban religion. The household in Charleston, South Carolina, and the State House Yard in Philadelphia, which is now known as Independence Square, right behind Independence Hall. I was interested in the State House itself, what's now Independence Hall, but I was also interested in the outdoor space right beyond it, where President Biden gave his address a year or two ago.
So let's pick on those taverns now. All of the cities had all of these dynamics. You could also study religion in New York and
sure
talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the talk about tavern life in all of the cities, and what was tavern life? Who ran them? What happened there? And were taverns? Well, go ahead. Go with that. I have another.
Right. In the 18th century, you have both rural taverns and urban taverns, right? A rural tavern is someplace that you might have to stop, hitch up your horse, get a night's rest, right? Because you've got a long journey ahead of you. You would obviously be able to get food and drink, et cetera, et cetera. Not all, but urban taverns have a variety of some of those same functions, but maybe not all of those functions. And cities had multiple taverns. I think I calculated that there was one drinking establishment for every 12 adult white men in New York City on the eve of the revolution. So there were just tons of taverns. They were meeting places. They were employment offices. They would sometimes be used for government functions. They were certainly used for the meetings of voluntary associations. They were certainly places where you could get drunk, but they were also places where you could exchange news, exchange talk, and do a variety of other things. There were particular taverns that catered to different political factions, different occupational groups, et cetera. I mean, a city like New York is mostly a walking city. You had your choice. You didn't necessarily have to go to the one that you lived right near. You could go to a variety of taverns. And as far as the ownership, sometimes tavern licenses or liquor licenses would be given to men or women as an act of charity, right? Like, oh, this person is out of work. Let's give them a tavern license, and then they'll be able to make money in that way, right? So not all tavern keepers were prominent middle class folks. In some cases, they were, as a form of social welfare, granted these licenses to distribute alcohol.
So this is the 18th century form of entertainment. You don't sit around TV and watch a football game. You go to a tavern.
You get together with people you know, and then have drinking contests and things like that.
And it's business, it's politics, it's entertainment, and that's the crux of urban life, really.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. So how did the economies of the different cities were very different? Newport, is a sailing port. Certainly, there's a lot of ship traffic in New York, but you're also trading up with the farms in the hinterlands. What about the different cities made them unique? I mean, they have a lot of things that are similar. What made them unique?
Yeah, it's funny. I just reviewed a book that argues, hey, let's not make big distinctions between the northern ports. They all basically have the same function, which is, feeding the Caribbean, and whatever commodities they have, whether it's fish in the case of Boston and ship, or agricultural produce in the New York and Philadelphia area. The point was to get the surplus to Southern Europe, to the Caribbean, to engage in the coastal trade. That, like, we can make too much of the distinct differences. I mean, of course, Boston is more dominated by people of the Congregationalist faith. And of course, Philadelphia has its substantial Quaker population. There were certainly differences among these cities, and I find those differences to be important. Charleston, probably the most distinctive, because it is the principal seaport of a slave society. I mean, look, New York is 14% African American as well. It's also a major slave port in some ways, but not anything like Charleston, which is the seat of the Low Country and the rice and indigo plantations. So Charleston is the most distinctive of the 5 large cities, and the wealthiest too. But the northern cities maybe had more in common than we might like to say, even though they have different kinds of populations as far as ethnicity and religion.
And then militarily, we'll certainly get into why New York was strategically important, and when we talk about the Great New York Fire. So,
well, all 5 of those cities were occupied by the British, in addition to Savannah, Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, and that was as we talk about the war, when we get into the war, the British had the problems breaking out into the hinterlands, as it were. Getting back to the book, what role did religion play in the cities, and how did that affect leading up to the revolution?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Like in Boston, you can say, oh, they're pretty ethnically and religiously homogeneous. This helps Boston to kind of stand united, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at most of the other cities, there's a lot of religious diversity. I mean, there's some in Boston as well. But, if you look at New York, right, and even Newport, right? Newport is part of Rhode Island. Rhode Island was considered weird for New Englanders. And it's really the Baptists and Quakers that really dominate Rhode Island politics. And so, whereas the Congregationalists and the Anglicans, which were otherwise very powerful denominations in the 13 colonies, they are a little bit more like second fiddle to those two. And Newport also has Moravians, Jews, members of some other denominations as well. Of course, you would find, if you went to other colonies, a substantial number of Presbyterians, members of other religious groups as well. So yeah, I focused on Newport because it was both part of New England, but also religiously diverse in this very interesting way. And I spent time actually looking at the buildings, because we have a few extant buildings in Newport: Toro Congregation, the Seventh-day Baptist Meeting House, some others, and some very good documentation of the buildings. I wanted to look at the interiors and the exteriors, see where they were distinct from one another, see where they were similar, get a sense of what it was like to be a member of an urban congregation when you have a choice of faiths that you might adhere to, and how did these different religious groups get along with one another, and does that help with political mobilization when it comes time to protesting the acts of parliament, or does it hamper it because these people have all these other things that they disagree about?
So is it fair to say that the dissatisfaction with the mother country and the really the early discussions about what they were going to do to protest against the mother country all started in the cities?
I mean, I think the cities have an excellent case for that. I mean, there were some important rural actions, right? If it weren't for Worcester County and, and Hampshire County in Massachusetts, right, we wouldn't have had some of the actions that we did in the months leading up to Lexington and Concord. Lexington and Concord itself was, a rural battle, right? So many of the battles of the revolution are not really fought in cities. They're fought in open fields somewhere in the countryside. But as far as, protesting against British officials and generating the newspaper items that were then disseminated throughout the countryside, the cities are really important. Of course, Virginia is not a particularly urban place, and we know Virginia was important to the Revolution too. It's the largest of the colonies. That's where Washington and Jefferson and George Mason, and all those guys are from. So I'm not saying cities are the be all end all, but certainly they play a vital role in mobilizing the American populace against Parliament and eventually against the king.
Right. So I need to make a little adjustment here. Okay, so so now we jump to the lost story of the American Revolution. Your latest book, The Great Fire of the Great New York Fire of 1776, picking up from your study in cities and rebel rising. We focus on New York and a particular event. First, let's talk about the strategic significance of New York. Why was it, as Washington called it, a post of infinite importance?
Yeah. I think it's when one of the first sentences of the book is like, New York was the most important spot on the map in 1776. And I gave a talk in California, and this professor who was from Philadelphia stood up and he's like, "What do you mean New York was the most important in 1776?" But if you look at it, I mean, they clearly are, right? Like there's an amphibious force of like 30,000-40,000 British people about to descend on New York. Clearly they thought it was important. Washington is trying to muster as many guys as he can to try and defend this archipelago of islands at the mouth of the Hudson River, essentially an impossible task if he doesn't have a navy. And so clearly, right, the stakes of who would possess New York were really, really high. I mean, it gives you access to the Hudson-Champlain corridor. It gives you access to New Jersey and Connecticut, to Long Island, right? I mean, it is just, on paper at least, it looks like an amazing spot for the British to occupy. Later on, the British are going to be like, man, Newport and Halifax are really just better for this purpose. Getting through Hell Gate was a nightmare. Like the harbor, it actually is not as good as people sometimes say, with all the sandbars and stuff, that like New York is actually not all it's cracked up to be as a naval base. But Washington, interestingly, is obsessed with taking back New York throughout the war. He has to be talked down from the ledge to go to Yorktown instead. He's like, "Wait, but I could attack New York. This is my chance." And they're like, "No, we don't need New York, right? Like, leave New York to the British. Let's trap Cornwallis's army instead."
Why he spent so much time in New Jersey. He needed to be close to what he thought was the ultimate goal. So after the siege of Boston, and they chased Howe and all the loyalists and out of Boston, it was so obvious that the next actions were going to be in New York. I mean, all of the correspondence. So is it because of everything that you've just outlined? I mean, at the time they realized that New York was what was the strategic point that had to be kept by both armies? Is that why?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's because of, right, like this idea that if you took control of the Hudson-Champlain corridor, right, the British already have Montreal and Quebec, that if they took control of the whole Hudson-Champlain corridor, they could cut New England off from the other colonies. I mean, this turns out to be a little bit delusional, And the British also think, oh, there's tons of loyalists in the New York area that will rally to our cause. And that's true to some extent. I mean, Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island were pretty loyalist. You had some pockets of loyalism, certainly in Westchester and New York City itself. But not enough for the British to be like, ah, yes, we will reestablish, a royal beachhead there. We'll attract, farmers to markets in New York City, and then, we'll basically turn the 13 colonies back into British colonies. That does not work out for the British, but they have high hopes that the loyalist population will rally to their in New York will rally to their standard, and that will solve all their problems.
And of course, they make this, with all their hubris, they make this mistake over and over again. Oh, well, Philadelphia is going to have all these loyalists there. And oh, well, and Charleston's going to have all these loyalists there. They kept believing this, that there were more loyalists than there were.
I mean, between Anglican ministers and government officials, you do have a lot, and traders with the British, right? You do have a lot of loyalists, concentrations of loyalists in all these cities, but you had all big concentrations of patriots too, at least until they flee in advance of the British army.
So before I go on to the next question, I just want to remind everybody in the audience that if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can use the chat feature down at the bottom of the screen. And I'm sure that we will have some time to get to some of your questions. So please feel free to throw some questions out to us. In chapter 2, The Great Fire of New York, you reference the British strategy in the destruction of Charleston and Falmouth, which is today's Portland, Maine. The sacking and the burning of towns was not new to warring factions, but this was different. I mean, you had the Royal Navy bombarding and burning port towns in British America. They're bombing their own people, as it were. Indiscriminate warfare, regardless of the citizens' loyalties. That's not exactly winning the hearts and minds. And didn't this affect the rest of the colonies? And what was the end game of the British? Why were they so aggressive there?
Well, I mean, it's almost funny in a way. And look, I mean, this is serious, right? The Americans mention it as a grievance in the Declaration of Independence. He has burnt our towns. So the Americans take it seriously. I mean, look, at Charlestown, they were firing at British soldiers from houses in Charlestown, Massachusetts. So, under the laws of war, yeah, you can burn houses in order to prevent that kind of thing. But I mean, if the British had said, we are going to just destroy everything in sight until you obey, that might have worked as a strategy. Or if they had said, we're not going to touch, a splinter of your homes in the hopes that you will reconcile, and we will show you what a great monarch we serve, that might have worked too. But by only burning a few towns, the British choose the worst of both strategies, because the Americans can kind of make hay of this as propaganda, but it's not enough to intimidate the Americans into returning to their obedience. So unfortunately, right, like the British are not really pursuing a strategy. They are they find a middle ground in between two strategies. One is the Professor Stephen Conway of University College London calls the fire and sword strategy, and the other is the reconciliationist strategy. And you can't do the middle strategy, because then you just alienate without intimidating. You have to kind of choose one or the other.
So Washington, while still in Boston, sends Charles Lee down to set up these defenses. And what was Charles Lee's reaction to that?
Well, he's setting up these defenses as there are British warships still commanding the harbor, and those warships still need to be supplied by New York City. And so there was still people openly being like, "Oh yeah, you need more hardtack or whatever, we'll sell that to you." And Charles Lee being like, "Wait a minute, if we're going to be a Patriot city, you can't be supplying British warships." And so he's trying to draw the rift even tighter, whereas the British warships are like, "Hey, if you don't supply us, we will bombard you." And so a lot of New Yorkers were like, whoa, let's just keep things peaceful for now. And Charles Lee is trying to just kind of whip everything up. He's like, I'm not scared. If you start bombarding us, we'll tie loyalists to the houses that you're firing on, and it'll become their funeral pyre. So so Lee is being quite radical in his strategy at that moment in early 1776.
So remind us again, the population of New York?
25,000. But of
25,000.
course, by 1776, people were, if they could flee, they were fleeing to the countryside because
Right.
everybody knew that the huge battle was about to happen there, and they don't want to be there when the bombardment starts. They leave their servants and enslaved people there, like to take care of the houses and say, "You guys take on the risk."
Exactly. So you have 25,000, and we look at the number of people who left town as Washington is starting to march his 19 to 21,000 troops into town. So let's say charitably we have 15,000. It's probably more than that, but 15,000 left in New York. And now about 20,000 Americans come. And then starting in July, you have almost 30,000 British and Hessians who are landing in New York. Put quite a strain on resources there, didn't it?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, yeah, one of the things that I try to convey in my book is that we never talk about New York as an American occupied city, but it really was for the spring and summer of 1776 before they evacuate on September 15th. We know that New York was a British occupied city from that point until November 25th, 1783, but we forget that there was like this period of American occupation too, when they're intimidating loyalists and doing all these other things.
And trying to set up defenses, all
Yeah,
not knowing
fortifying,
where.
sure. Yeah.
So you've got troops off Staten Island and troops in Manhattan Island and troops on Long Island. They're all over the place.
Washington is spread thin. That's right.
Is spread very, very thin. So you don't delve into the battle and that much, but certainly it
You're
is
talking about Kips Bay or Brooklyn?
about, well, in Brooklyn, that was a huge battle that basically literally wiped them off the map. Over to Kips Bay onto Manhattan. At what point was there the discussions Washington had with some of his officers about what to do with New York? I mean, did they really feel that they were going to hang on to New York after they were losing all of these battles?
I mean, the smart money, most of Washington's war council is like, we can't defend this. We got to get out of here. But there's two ways you can get out of here, right? You can leave the city intact, or you can do the scorched earth thing and burn it behind you, right? Do you want the British to have this as a headquarters and a naval base and a beacon for loyalists throughout what's now the tri-state area? Or do you want to leave it as smoldering ruins so that the British cannot gain any strategic advantage from that post? And while we know that the War Council was saying evacuate, evacuate, there's some hints in the archives that Nathaniel Greene and John Jay and others were kind of saying, you got to burn the city behind you. You should burn the city and all the suburbs and don't leave anything for the British to take advantage of. Without a navy, we're never going to be able to take this post back. Like, just leave nothing behind. And Washington's like, well, I'm not going to stick my neck out and do that on my own. So he kind of asks Congress, and at least in the documentation we have, Congress is like, no, let no damage be done, et cetera, et cetera. And Washington seems to say, okay. And for many, many years, that's all historians knew. And they're like, oh, that's it. He asked Congress. Congress said, no, QED. Washington had nothing to do with it. He's in the clear. And I'm like, but at Washington, at some point during that correspondence says, hey, by the way, if you are going to tell me to burn it, make sure you keep it a profound secret because it'll make a huge change in the British plans. So, okay, he wants there to be secrecy. Does that mean that there's a separate letter from Congress being like, yeah, okay, do what you got to do, that then was like ripped up and historians have nothing to read? Like, there's a very good possibility. I don't want to sound like a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but I think we have to at least allow for the possibility that, like, what historians have to use is only what was left to be found. And this was exactly the kind of thing that Washington would not want left to be found. Now, there's another letter that is not really available to historians until after World War II. Because that's when some of Washington's private papers become more available. And he was writing to Lund Washington, the caretaker at Mount Vernon, his cousin, saying, yeah, he's like, man, this was such a mistake. Congress should have let me burn it. This was like a huge error of theirs. And then a couple of paragraphs later, he's like, oh yeah, by the way, I forgot to mention, Providence or some good honest fellow has done what we didn't see fit to do for ourselves. Something like that. By Providence, he means God, right? Like God or some good honest fellow has burned New York City, even though Congress was telling me not to. So he's kind of like, wink, wink, ha ha. The only problem is that the British still have, like, the fire didn't do enough damage, right? It only burned 20% of the city. There's, enough of it remains to answer the British purposes. So Washington's only annoyance is that not enough of the city was burned. But this was not well known. This was not really known among historians until the 1940s.
So what was, I don't want to give away too much of the book because this reads like a thriller, quite frankly. What you set up the first third of your book, really, you sort of set up the scene in terms of how they got to New York and what's going on in and around New York. And then the conflagration that just, as you said, wipes out a big part of the city. But what was the reaction of Congress when the city was burned?
A couple of the delegations write about it to their constituents. The New York delegation is really a little bit ambiguous. We have the North Carolina delegation's letter. The most official statement from Congress that I focus on is Benjamin Franklin and Robert Morris, constituted as the Committee of Secret Correspondence. They send a letter over to Silas Deane in Paris saying, here's what to say to the French about this. They say, they're going to try and pin the blame on us, but we didn't do it. Washington was 7 miles away, and Congress had told him not to. And the British clearly just strung up a bunch of people arbitrarily. And, don't worry, we had nothing to do with it. And so I think this is really part of a spin campaign coming out of both Congress and Washington's own headquarters.
So, as you mentioned before, the what's written in the history books is that, oh, well, Washington didn't want to burn down the city and it just started all by itself.
Right.
Okay.
Or that it was an accident or some miscreant, right, with no political values of any kind, right? These things happen.
Yeah.
But although that's not all they do, the Americans also say, and look, the British and Hessians are such monsters. They're slitting people's throats and they're plundering and all this, they're killing women, right? The stuff that, like, some of it was a little bit true, but some of it was just not true at all. So in other words, it's the British who are committing atrocities. Let's keep our eye on the ball here, right? Nobody pay attention to the fact that we've been saying for months that we will burn New York City if we ever have to evacuate it. Don't put two and two together and say that the Americans actually did it. Instead, look at how monstrously the British are behaving.
So the Howe brothers are famously Whigs and were doing their best as in their role as peace commissioners to try and bring these subjects back into the fold. What was their reaction?
I mean, Howe writes to Germain, like, yeah, the Americans definitely did this. We caught a bunch of people in the act. It's like what really interests me about the Howes is not what they say officially. I mean, what they say officially is what every British and loyalist observer said, which is, oh my God, they caught Americans doing this. The Americans clearly did this. The fire broke out in multiple places at once. They said they were going to do this. They waited for the city to be evacuated and the firefighting equipment to be damaged and the bells to be removed. And then they took advantage of a high wind and tried to burn the whole place down. The Americans did it. That's what all the British and loyalists say. That, to me, what the Howes do, I mean, the Howes themselves were in like the middle of Manhattan and they're facing Washington's army, and they're not really paying a ton of attention to this, right? It's just one among many other things that they're dealing with. What's interesting to me is that the Howes don't really seem to lean on the commandant, James Robertson, to prosecute further. They catch a bunch of guys, but then they seem to have let most of them go. They keep a couple of military men as prisoners of war, but they were keeping lots of military men as prisoners of war. And the Howes, I think, because they're trying to reconcile, don't engage in further prosecutions. They're kind of like, all right, the British executed a number of people on the spot on the night of the fire. We'll leave it at that for now. And so the Howes don't really push the point, which is something I kind of explore and try to unpack in one of the later chapters.
Right. And at this point in the war, the population of England, I mean, most of the citizens of England were really pissed off at the colonists. What was written about the fire in the New York in the English papers?
I use a ton of stuff from English papers. Most of them were reprinted correspondence from people in the British Army and Navy, actually, and some loyalists. So, mostly what you're reading is just the news items that came from New York. Actually, that's what I find really interesting. You don't really see a lot of commentary. One thing that I found really interesting was a kind of American supporter writing a number of months later, being like, this happens. First of all, the British had destroyed a lot of American towns. Why wouldn't the Americans do this too? Like, and we're kind of justifying it. That's an interesting argument made by a pro-American British person that and it's an argument that the Americans themselves do not make. The Americans do not then step forward and being like, yeah, if Washington did it, he was right to do it. The Americans never say that, at least not in anywhere very prominent. So I find that kind of interesting, where the Americans are kind of like, let's shy away from this and try and make it all about British atrocity. But there were some English American supporters being like, war is hell, guys. Like, the Americans, knew what was up and, and had their own reasons for revenge. And then they went ahead and did it. So again, that's just one random newspaper item. It might've been written by an American who was in exile in London, in England at the time. But I found the newspaper reactions to the fire after the fire to be one of my most interesting pieces of evidence. And what I always tell scholars is that I think chapter 11 is the chapter where I'm making the most interesting point, in a way that, like, it's very hard to get a smoking gun about who set the fire, although I think I have some very, very good evidence. But one thing that's certain to me is that there was definitely a newspaper campaign by Washington's men to make sure nobody believed that the Americans had done it.
So I read a lot of books. I read them very fast. And when I got to chapter 11, I started reading, and I had to go back and say, wait a minute, let me really read this deeply, because what you written in chapter 11, the story of the fire takes shape. This is why I said this reads like a political thriller. I mean, I don't know. I know there's some TV shows about firefighters and all that sort of stuff, but this was fascinating. How did you uncover all of this stuff? Where did you get this material?
I mean, again, digital databases are really helpful, although they don't do everything. I mean, what I basically tried to do was just read through as many newspapers. In the American case, I tried to read through as many October and November newspapers as I could. And in the British case, the news doesn't really get there until November. So I read as many November and December newspapers as I could, just looking for anything that was talking about the news out of New York. I found I was able to figure out, okay, like, a lot of English newspapers reprint the same stuff, but there were at least like maybe 20 distinct accounts, say 15 to 20 distinct accounts. Maybe it's even more, maybe it's like 24, with just these very different discrete reports about the fire that were just a gold mine of information. And so it's really interesting to look at those patterns, and then to see the way different items were distributed in, let's say, New England, more American supporting papers, was also really interesting. I mean, I'm very grateful to I did a lot of this work during the pandemic. And so I'm very grateful to the Burney newspaper collections for the British stuff, and to America's historical newspapers for the American stuff. I mean, this is all due to the efforts of archivists and who digitized these things.
So you call the subtitle here is The Lost Story of the American Revolution. It wasn't a huge battle. It took place after a huge battle. But it was a tremendous event that, you're right, it's sort of passed over, and it's never really in any history books or anything. What do you think is what is so significant about the fire in terms of what does it change in the revolution?
I mean, in terms of its consequence, that's different about what I think is significant about the fire. In terms of what's most consequential about the fire, it's the housing shortage that it caused in New York throughout the war. But as far as what I think is most significant about the fire, I think it's two things. One is that the fire enables me to tell a story, not just from the perspective of the soldiers and the founding fathers, right? But to kind of look at Hessians, at women, at people of color, at ordinary soldiers, at British soldiers, British naval captains, right? To kind of get a little bit more of a sense of the whole cast of characters that made up the Revolutionary era. Spies, saboteurs, right? To look at the ugly side of the military history of the Revolution, I thought was really revealing.
And you,
But my other purpose in writing the book is, the late Jan Lewis used to say that there's a kind of bedtime story version of the American Revolution, that it was this kind of happy moment of liberty, equality, and unity. And I think that there are other ways to tell the story of the Revolutionary era that both incorporate that larger cast of characters, but also kind of show war and our war of origins in a little bit more of a warts and all kind of way. It's not that I'm, unpatriotic or anything, but I always think that the best form of patriotism is to be a little bit critical of your country. And so I tried to write a critical history of this really interesting moment of the American Revolution.
well, and you succeeded tremendously. It's as you said, I mean, probably in this entire show, we've mentioned 3 or 4 or 5 maybe of the founding fathers, as it were. This is all 3 of your books are stories about the people, are stories about the names that we don't know, that you've brought to light, that you have given us a sense of what life was really, really like. And that's why I really wanted to give everybody the opportunity to hear a little bit about each of your books, so that your books should be in their libraries as well, so that we learn about the people. Now, you're now on a clip of having published a new book every 3 years. Well, 3 years from now is
No. There was a huge gap between the Tea Party and this one. Give me a
oh,
rest,
that's
man.
right. Yes, of course.
I've earned my cocktail umbrella.
All right. Well, my question is, what's coming up? What are you working on now?
Oh, I don't know. I've got an idea about a way. I don't want to say.
Oh,
I've got some ideas brewing, but I need a little bit more time before I can really get started.
that is very fair. Ben, I want to thank you for your time this evening. This was terrific. Thanks for answering my questions. I hope everyone else had a great time. I sure did, and I really appreciate the scholarship and how you were able to take academics and turn it into wonderful narratives. So thank you
Thank you so
very,
much. I
very much.
appreciate it.
And that's it for tonight, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. And I hope to see you again on History Author Talks. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Bye-bye.